Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. Chapter 1. Divided Sleep. When sleeping in 2 shifts was normal. For many years I believed my restless nights were a whim of time or age, until I remembered how sleep truly was in the days of my youth. Back then there was no obligation to sleep for long, uninterrupted hours. On the contrary, our nights were divided like a well-structured book, a first chapter of deep sleep, followed by a calm interlude, and then the second sleep, softer, gentler, like a dreamed epilogue. In the village where I grew up just after nightfall, windows would close, candles were snuffed out, and silence spread like a thick blanket. Everyone fell asleep early, lulled by the crackling of firewood and the distant murmurs of roosters dreaming of dawn. But around midnight, many of us would wake naturally, without fright or anxiety. It was the hour of the vigil, as we called it, and it wasn't seen as insomnia to be fought, but rather a gentle pause between 2 realms of rest. Some would use this hour to pray, kneeling on folded cloths before the hearth, murmuring psalms that sounded like whispered conversations with time itself. Others would simply sit at the edge of the bed, gently stirring the embers, sipping small spoonfuls of warm broth forgotten in the corner of the fireplace. And there were those, like my grandfather, who used the time to tell stories, not the grand, epic ones, but the small tales that only made sense in the hours when the world sleeps. It was in that interval between the first and second sleep that soft confessions happened. A father would speak quietly with his son, without urgency. A woman would write a note by the flickering light of a candle. 2 neighbors would meet in the pen to check if the sheep were at peace. The night was not a continuous veil, but a tapestry stitched with small gestures, almost always invisible to the haste of daylight. I remember with tenderness how my mother used to embrace that time. She would rise slowly, as if she were part of the darkness itself, and light a candle with an almost ceremonial care. She would sit by the window, embroidering in the dim light, not out of necessity, but because she said the stillness of the night made the stitches more beautiful. Sometimes she would hum softly, not lullabies, but melodies without words, made only of sound and longing. The second sleep would arrive like a friend returning to fetch you. It was lighter, sweeter, as if the body no longer needed to prove anything to the world. No one rushed back to bed. Sleep came on its own, soft and inevitable, drawing you back into the warmth of the straw pillow where dreams waited, silent, to resume their stories. There was something magical in that nocturnal interval, a kind of crack in time where thought seemed sharper and silence had texture. It was then that many would write letters, mend small tears, or simply gaze at the sky through the crack in the window, trying to guess whether rain would come with the sunrise. It wasn't a forced vigil, but a pause the body knew by heart, like the secret rhythm of an old clock with no hands. Even the monks in their stone monasteries would wake during that in-between time. They would gather for matins, cloaked in thick robes, chanting in Latin that echoed through cold walls, as if conversing with the angels of the dark. They said the soul could hear better in that deep silence, and I believed them. I still do. In the house where I spent my youth, everyone knew about the midnight waking, even if no clock announced it. It was the creak of my father's bed, the soft pop of rekindled firewood, or the gentle clink of the kettle on the flame. Each sound had its place, its moment, like part of a family ritual that needed no words to be understood. The whole house breathed in that rhythm. We slept, we woke, and we slept again. Like the tides, obeying the moon. It wasn't uncommon to find neighbors walking the road at that hour, sometimes with a lantern in hand, sometimes guided only by memory. They'd check on the chickens, tend to a newborn calf, or simply enjoy the quiet as they strolled between fences. No one found it odd. The nighttime world was lived gently, and everything done between first and second sleep was seen as a natural part of existence. Over time, I realized that this divided sleep wasn't a sign of disorder, but of harmony with the rhythm of things. The absence of artificial light allowed the body to choose its own tempo, guided only by the night's chill, the warmth of the hearth, the rustle of leaves outside. There was a quiet wisdom in that, an ancient understanding that rest didn't have to be continuous to be complete. Today, when I wake in the middle of the night, I still carry that old habit in my heart. I don't rush to fall asleep again. I sit for a while, listening to the silence around me as if listening to a forgotten language. Sometimes I sip water, think about small things, let a gentle thought lead me back to the pillow. And when I finally give myself to the second sleep, I feel I belong to something larger, older, as if time itself was sleeping beside me. It's curious to think that for centuries, this habit was as common as lighting a candle at dusk. And yet, little by little, it faded. Not from mistake or forgetfulness, but because the world became brighter, faster, more filled with obligations and less attuned to the whispers of the night. The first and second sleep gave way to a single stretch of slumber, regulated by clocks and calendars, and the nighttime interlude, with all its quiet rituals, was left behind. But on some cold nights, when the house is still and the wind blows with the same tone I remember from childhood, I like to believe that old custom still lives in me, and perhaps in you too. That a part of us still awakens between dreams, lights an imaginary candle, watches the shadows dance on the walls, and feels deep within that time is not so rigid after all. There were also those who used that time to write letters, prayers, recipes, drifting thoughts. They said the words found in the silence of dawn were more truthful, as if harvested directly from the soul, still damp with dreams. My great-uncle, for instance, would jot down ideas that only came to him in that interval. He swore his best verses arrived between first and second sleep, carried by the breeze that slipped beneath the door. And maybe it was true, because there was a kind of magic in that grey hour, when the world still slept, but the spirit had begun to move. It was a moment without demands, without urgency, where thought stretched like a soft blanket. Sometimes just watching a candle's flame tremble was enough to feel something sacred happening, something small, intimate, but infinitely precious. In time, I understood that brief awakening was more than a pause. It was a mirror, a space where the mind could see itself without the masks of the day. It was there that many made important decisions, remembered forgotten names, cried quietly, or simply found peace, embraced by the distant sound of a rooster that had yet to crow. The world seemed suspended, as if waiting for our permission to keep turning. And when we finally returned to bed, wrapping ourselves in blankets with bodies lighter and hearts unburdened, the second sleep arrived unhurried. It was a different kind of rest, not only of weariness, but of surrender. Like returning home after a brief nocturnal stroll through one's own memories, and upon waking there was always that feeling of having lived 2 nights in one for the body, another for the soul. Today, few remember this old tradition, but now and then, when someone tells me they woke in the middle of the night and didn't know why, I smile inwardly. Perhaps the body still remembers, even if the mind has forgotten. Perhaps, in some quiet corner of our simplest inheritance, the first and second sleep still wait patiently for the hour to find their rightful place again. So, if the night is still and you open your eyes for no apparent reason, don't be alarmed. Stay, listen. Perhaps it's just old time calling back its ancient rituals. Grab a blanket, light a gentle glow, let your thoughts wander. Because sometimes what we need most is not to sleep straight through till morning, but to remember how lovely it was, to wake in the middle of the night, and simply exist. Chapter 2. Sleeping upright to keep the demons away. During the longest winters of my youth, there was a peculiar custom many of us followed without a second thought. It wasn't for comfort, nor out of vanity. It was out of fear, a subtle fear wrapped in silence, like the breeze slipping through the cracks of an ill-sealed window. We slept sitting up, or almost, our backs upright against the rough wooden headboard, pillows stacked at unlikely angles, and legs tucked beneath blankets up to our chests, as if we were always ready to rise. That's how it was in the room I shared with my grandfather. He would say, in his hoarse voice, the voice of someone who had seen more than he wished, that lying down completely was an invitation for demons. "They think you've already left," he'd murmur, adjusting my posture with care. "And when they believe you're dead, they come to see if your soul is still around." The candles would go out one by one, and the crackling fire in the corner would slowly lose its battle against the cold. Yet there we were, sentinels of our own souls, tilted like statues keeping watch. And when dreams came at last, they came short, fragmented, as if even they feared lingering too long. I remember well how every bed looked more like an improvised throne than a place of rest. The mattresses were firm straw, designed not for comfort, but to hold the body in a posture that wouldn't attract unwanted attention. The pillows, when there were any, were filled with tired feathers, stacked not just to elevate the head, but the entire chest, as if sleep were a ritual that required vigilance. A friend's mother even sewed small extra cushions, not out of affection, but out of superstition. "Better to support the body than risk the soul," she'd say, aligning them with almost ceremonial precision. There was something about the darkness of those nights that made us believe the invisible walked among us. Dogs barked without reason, windows creaked with no wind, and sometimes, just sometimes, we felt a shift in the air, a subtle weight pressing on the chest, as if something were watching. In those moments, whoever slept on their side would turn away. Those lying flat would sit up in a jolt, and those already sleeping upright would simply breathe deeply and give thanks for being halfway between wakefulness and hiding from the eyes of the beyond. This habit didn't belong only to peasant homes. Even in certain monasteries, I'd heard, the monks kept their bodies inclined during sleep, afraid that in the complete surrender of slumber, the spirit might wander too far. Deep sleep, they said, was a breach, a half-open door that, if left unguarded, could invite in things not of the living world. There were specific prayers said before bed, not so much to invite pleasant dreams, but to ward off the unwelcome presences that drifted through the dark corners of rooms and of souls. Even the skeptics, those who laughed at tales of apparitions and nighttime demons, ended up yielding to the custom. Maybe from fear, maybe tradition, or perhaps simply because, in the cold and silent hours before dawn, when all you hear is your own heartbeat and the wood settling beneath the weight of the night, even doubt casts shadows. In those moments, keeping oneself slightly upright felt less like protection and more like humility, like saying to the invisible, "It's not my time yet. I'm still here, still awake." Mothers, above all, were the guardians of this practice. I remember a neighbor, Donna Anselma, who arranged her children like delicate dolls, always murmuring prayers as she propped up their small heads with folded cloth. "So the angel knows they're alive," she'd whisper, kissing their foreheads with a tenderness laced with fear. Her voice carried sweetness, but also something deeper, the echo of generations who had learned, perhaps the hard way, that sleep could be treacherous, that not every child who closed their eyes would open them by morning. And there were the elderly, who sat up out of habit even when no one remembered why. I recall a great-uncle, old as the furniture in the house, who fell asleep every night in his high-backed chair, wrapped in blankets up to his chin. When asked why he never used a bed, he'd smile without showing teeth and simply say, "The nights know more than the days, and I'd rather not lie down beside them." He said it with half-closed eyes, as if already dozing, or perhaps already watching. In time, I came to understand that the gesture, sleeping upright, the body alert even in rest, was less about fearing demons and more about respecting the night. Because night in those times was almost a presence. Not merely the absence of sunlight, but a time when the world shifted its rhythm and whispered things came alive. Silence was thick, dreams had weight, and every creak of the woods sounded like a warning. Sleeping upright was a way of saying to the darkness, I know you're there, and I am still here. Even now, after so many years and forgotten customs, there are nights when I catch myself stacking the pillows higher than needed. Not from belief, or perhaps a little, but from old habit, inherited memory, or maybe because there's something comforting in that position between sleep and wakefulness, as if we were still guarding our own passage to morning. There is a peculiar kind of peace in sleeping that way. It's not the soft surrender of someone giving themselves wholly to the mattress, but the cautious serenity of a traveler resting by the roadside. Eyes closed, yes, but ears tuned to the murmurs of the night. And in that space between daylight and whispers, dreams are born differently, slower, less free, like old memories drifting through the mind with no urgency to be understood. And when the sun finally touches the windows with pale fingers, there is always a moment when the body straightens on its own, as if to say, I am still here. It's a gentle awakening without shock, like someone who crossed the darkness in silence and returned whole. Then the pillows are unstacked, the blanket folded with care, and for a brief second, you almost hear the echo of those old whispered words. Better this way, sitting up, just in case. Today, centuries later, bedrooms are warm, beds are soft, and night has lost much of its mystery. But sometimes, when the wind blows colder or the house falls unusually still, something in me remembers, not with fear, but with longing. Those times when the dark had a voice, and sleep was also a gesture of protection. On those nights, I sit on the bed for just a moment longer before lying down, take a deep breath, and allow myself to recall. There was a time when that alone was enough to soothe the soul. And perhaps that is the true magic of memories, not how faithfully they reproduce the facts, but the gentle way they warm the heart. Because even the feared nights, the stacked pillows, and the half-closed eyes, all of that now rests with me, like stories whispered on the edge of sleep, like old songs that no longer need to be sung, only felt. Chapter 3. A shared bed among strangers in the inns. I remember one particularly cold night, in a small inn on the outskirts of a village that no longer appears on any map. I had walked the entire day, my feet covered in dust, my shoulders still bearing the weight of a windy autumn. When I finally arrived, the dim candlelight spilled through the wooden cracks, and the muffled sound of tired laughter filled the air. The innkeeper, a man of few words and many grumbles, pointed toward a straw bed already occupied by two other travelers, a calm-faced shoemaker and a pilgrim who slept deeply, clinging to his coat as if it were his last defense against the world. It wasn't uncommon in those days to share a bed with strangers. Beds were few, space even fewer, and the cold was an impatient creature that slipped under doors and into your clothes. The unspoken rule was simple. Each one occupied their portion of the straw mattress, lying on their side, hands to themselves, sighs restrained. There was a kind of silent respect in that collective gesture of survival. No one said much, but we all understood that the warmth of another body, even an unfamiliar one, was sometimes what separated discomfort from relief, or sleep from insomnia. Sometimes in the middle of the night, a foot might brush against another, a louder breath might break the stillness, or someone mumbled something sleepy, caught between dreams and memories. But there was an implicit kindness in those nighttime stumbles. No one got upset. The bed was neutral ground, not yours, not mine, but ours, as long as we sought a brief refuge there. The sound of fire dying in the hearth, the crack of wood shrinking with the cold, and the rhythmic breath of others became a lullaby. Imperfect, but enough. To share a bed back then was more than sharing space. It was an unspoken pact of trust. You trusted the other wouldn't jab their elbow into your ribs, wouldn't talk too loudly, wouldn't steal more than their share of the blanket, and you did the same in return. It was rarely discussed. It was as ordinary as the hard bread at breakfast or the lingering scent of onions that seemed to live forever in your clothes. But in a strange way, there was something moving in that uncomfortable arrangement, as if by sharing the discomfort it became just a little easier to bear. Once I slept beside an old storyteller who traveled with a carved walking stick and a sack of dried nuts he shared with anyone who listened in silence. That night, before blowing out the candle, he simply murmured, "Dream of warm places, lad." And so I did. We woke in the same position we'd fallen asleep, like straw dolls carefully aligned. He handed me a walnut in the morning, and we went our separate ways, never asking each other's names. Sometimes I think that kind of anonymity was a gift, as if some people came only to warm a corner of the night and then vanished into the fog. Not every encounter was so gentle, of course. There were those who snored like they were swallowing a windmill, those who dreamed too loudly, those who tossed so much they seemed to have three bodies in one. On those nights, sleep was a rougher journey, but still shared. We never truly slept alone. Even on the hardest nights, there was always another breath nearby to remind us that the world, as harsh as it could be, still had people in it. And that, in itself, was a quiet comfort. Even the humblest inns seemed to understand the importance of shared warmth. Some offered blankets as thin as veils, others only a bundle of dry straw and hope. But what truly warmed you was the custom itself, the old practice of accepting the presence of another as part of your rest. It was a kind of folk wisdom, not taught with words, but with gestures, curling your legs to make room, gently covering the neighbor who shivered, turning your face away at the first sign of a tired sigh. Sleeping together wasn't about intimacy, it was about social survival, a nighttime choreography performed without rehearsal. And if a traveler arrived late, stumbling in from sleep and cold, the bodies already in bed would simply shift, opening a space between them like waves parting for a tired boat. No complaints, no questions. That's how it worked. For a few hours we were all the same, tired, worn out, just craving the blessing of forgetfulness. And when the rooster crowed and the straw scratched our backs, we rose like strangers who had shared a secret. And maybe, in some way, we had. The secret of having survived the night together. There was also an unwritten etiquette, a kind of medieval delicacy that everyone seemed to understand without ever being taught. You avoided speaking too much before sleep, especially if someone already had their eyes closed. Sneezes were muffled into sleeves, coughs stifled with near heroic effort. And if something embarrassing happened, a loud snore, a strange murmur, an accidental brush of feet, it was ignored with the dignity of someone who knows that in the dark, we're all just bodies trying to rest. It didn't matter whether you were a weaver, a weary priest, or a young woman fleeing domestic duties. Under that coarse shared blanket, what remained was simply human fatigue. The warmth of others, the quiet closeness, the sound of creaking wood on the roof, it all blended into a recipe as old as sleep itself. And strangely, the more unfamiliar we were to one another, the easier it seemed to drift off, as if mutual unfamiliarity removed judgment and weight, leaving only the gentle vulnerability of surrendering to the night. One night, I awoke for a brief moment, not from noise or discomfort, but from a silence so deep it seemed outside of time. The small inn window let in a sliver of moonlight, just enough to cast shadows over the sleeping forms beside me. And there they were, the calloused-handed farmer, the girl with unruly braids, the merchant who had spoken too much at supper, all still, breathing at different rhythms, yet bound by the same unspoken pact. Sleep until the world calls us back. I remember, with a tenderness that still surprises me, the moment when one of them, perhaps in a dream, whispered someone's name with softness, a name I didn't recognize, but one that clearly brought them comfort. And it was then I realized, even when sharing a bed with complete strangers, we were never truly alone. Each carried their pain, their fears, their longings. But there, amid the creaking floorboards and shared warmth, we found a brief truce, a rest no riches could ever buy. Over the years, I've laid down in many unfamiliar beds, some wide, others so narrow we had to sleep like sardines in a row, breathing in unison. Every inn had its quirks, but the feeling was always familiar. The rough sheet, the pillow more sack than cushion, the unmistakable scent of people and old wood, and that fleeting, almost sacred moment when everyone sighed at once before falling asleep, as if to say, without speaking, "We're safe for now." And if one of the guests rose early, they moved with the care of someone walking through a field of swallow nests. They would lift their boots with delicacy, avoid the boards that creaked, cast a final glance at the bodies still wrapped in sleep, and then leave. And the others, half awake, would simply close their eyes again, trusting that this quiet absence was part of the ritual. After all, the world outside could be harsh, but beneath a shared blanket there was always a trace of humanity warmed by the simple act of sleeping together. Today, when I lie alone in a large, silent bed, I sometimes recall those narrow nights. I don't miss the discomfort, the cold feet, the missing springs, the scratchy blankets. But I do feel a quiet longing for that rare, precious feeling, the sense of belonging, even if only for a few hours, even with strangers. There was honesty in that gesture of sleeping side by side. No defenses, no masks, just tired bodies seeking shelter from the cold of the world. And perhaps that's why these memories remain with me. Because they don't speak only of hard beds or noisy inns, but of silent camaraderie, of unspoken respect, of human warmth in its simplest, truest form. To sleep beside someone, without needing to say a word, was an old lesson that all of us, in the end, just want to lay our hearts down for a few hours in a world that rarely grants us permission to do so. So, if sleep escapes you one night, and you find yourself restless beneath modern sheets and soft pillows, perhaps it's worth imagining yourself there, in a straw bed, among unknown voices, hearing the distant crackle of a dying fire and feeling the gentle brush of a stranger's elbow. Not as a bother, but as a reminder that we never sleep entirely alone, because there's something deeply comforting in knowing that, in hard times, the simple warmth of another body helped keep entire generations alive. And so this memory ends, not with a grand deed or a famous name, but with a coarse blanket, 3 bodies in a row, and a shared sigh beneath the darkness. A quiet memory, soft as a tuft of wool forgotten on a pillow that still warms my coldest nights. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be gentle, and should the bed be tight, may there always be room for one more tired heart. Chapter 4. When the rich slept upright and the poor on the ground. There was a time, and I remember it well, when the way someone slept said far more than words ever could. It was a silent language, made of straw, carved wood, and tapestries that danced in the breeze, slipping through the cracks. In those days, sleep was not a universal right, but a privilege shaped by fortune, blood, and often patience. The noble lay upon soft feathers, surrounded by thick curtains that shielded them from the cold and the voices of the night. The peasant, however, slept wherever they could, sometimes in the still warm hay of the stable, sometimes on the bare ground, knees drawn in tight to preserve warmth. In my village, the sounds of the night varied from home to home. There was the lonely crackle of hearth fires in the manor houses, muffled by thick stone walls, And there were the whispers of crickets near the packed earth floors in humble huts where every noise of nature seemed to take part in the conversation. The wind blew through thatched roofs and stone cellars, singing different songs to those sleeping on embroidered pillows and those huddled under shared blankets with siblings and chickens. But somehow, all of us, rich or poor, fell asleep under the same dark sky, lulled by the same gentle promises of rest. I remember the first time I visited the manor of a feudal lord, not as a guest, but as the blacksmith's helper, sent to fix a broken hinge. There I saw a bed like none I had ever imagined, high, enormous, wrapped in a heavy linen canopy that hung from the ceiling like a private sky. The carved oak posts held not just fabric, but pride. They said some nobles slept nearly upright, propped on piled cushions, afraid the blood might rush to their heads if they lay flat, or that dreams, insolent things, might approach more freely than desired. It was the opposite of what we lived in the village. There, sleep was total surrender. We spread blankets over the hay, sometimes not even that, and lay our whole bodies down, seeking warmth from the earth and from one another. The children came first, clustered like puppies, and then the adults, adjusting themselves into the available space and the snoring that always came early. There was no luxury, true, but there was company. An arm across the chest, a cold foot under the leg, small gestures that reminded us that even in harsh times no one was alone in the night's cold. The sounds that surrounded us made up an imperfect but strangely comforting symphony. The pop of embers in the hearth, the heavy breathing of a grandfather wrapped in his woolen cloak, the throat clearing of a hen who insisted on sleeping with the children. From time to time, a dog would stir in the corner, chasing off an imaginary rat or dreaming of past hunts, and in the background, the wind, always the wind, whistled through the rafters like an old storyteller who never tires. For us, this wasn't a nuisance. It was the sound of home, the background to our dreams. In the houses of the wealthy, silence was another thing. Not natural, but imposed. Thick rugs silenced footsteps, thick walls muted the outside world, and even the fire crackled quietly, almost ceremoniously. And yet, I once heard a page boy, wide-eyed and soft-spoken, say that the lords too woke in the middle of the night for no clear reason, wandering in their nightclothes like restless souls. Some said it was in their blood or in their sins. That wealth didn't banish ghosts, it only made them more polite. In the cold winter dawns, while we pressed against one another for warmth, the nobles would heat bricks in the fireplace and wrap them in cloth, placing them at the foot of their beds like tiny household embers. Some even had servants whose sole nighttime duty was to keep the fire alive and block the drafts that crept in through stained glass windows. But, ironically, many of them still complained of the cold just as much as we did. Because no feather bed warms a lonely heart, and no tapestry quiets the noise of a restless conscience. Our nights, though harsh, were filled with familiar presence. The straw bed creaked with every movement, betraying who dreamed too loudly, or who rolled over looking for space that no longer existed. Sometimes the smell of straw mixed with the leather of shoes by the bed, or with the smoky scent clinging to yesterday's clothes. It was all very simple, very raw, but also very alive. Each night brought with it a new arrangement of bodies, blankets, and whispered stories before sleep, as if we were reweaving, right there, the invisible threads that held us together. There was also an old wisdom that hovered over how we slept. The elders used to say that sleep came in two parts, like bread split at supper. The first, just after nightfall, was deep and silent, like a dive into darkness. The second, after a gentle waking, was lighter, more dreamy, sometimes filled with whispered conversation, quiet prayers, or the simple act of listening to the house, the crack of a branch outside, the wind tapping at the door, the almost imperceptible breathing of someone you love. In those hours, we weren't fully awake, but not fully asleep either. I remember one such early hour when I woke and saw my mother sitting at the edge of the straw bed, carefully mending one of our woolen caps. She worked by the glow of embers, fingers swift and gaze distant, as if stitching not only fabric, but the scattered pieces of the day. She didn't say a word, just smiled when she saw my open eyes and pointed to the corner where our cat slept, curled like a lazy comma. And there, in that shared silence and the scent of old smoke, I understood that warmth doesn't come from what we have, but from what we share. Travelers passing through our village used to say we slept like animals, all together on the hard floor, among worn clothes and wisps of hay. And maybe we were closer to the earth than to the nobleman's embroidered heavens. But there was beauty in that shared ground. There were stories told before sleep, fingers intertwined beneath blankets, and the subtle warmth of bodies that slowly blended into the night's silence. Every breath was a candle lit against the dark, every sigh a reminder that we were still there, alive, whole, in spite of everything. In the castles, rest was solemn, almost theatrical. The high beds required little steps to reach, and the canopies hung like stage curtains reserved for forgetfulness. Some slept with crucifixes beneath their pillows, others with confession letters beside them, fearing that the night might carry away more than dreams. And the sounds. The sounds were muffled, yes, but not absent. The creak of ancient wood, the whisper of footsteps in a distant corridor, and sometimes, far away, the wind's lament against the stone towers, a sound as old as time itself, carrying the day's unspoken secrets. Even with all their pomp, nobles weren't free from discomfort. Their beds, though wide and adorned, creaked like ours, and their pillows, stuffed with goose feathers, didn't always bring true rest. Some ordered psalms to be read aloud until sleep overcame them. Others lay with eyes wide open, staring at the embroidered canopy, trying to read in the golden threads the promise of gentler days. For many of them, sleep was just another ceremony, and not rarely one performed with fear, for the night's silence echoed guilts the bright halls of day would never dare expose. Among peasants, there was no time for such unrest. Fatigue ran so deep that dreams came swiftly, almost as a continuation of the day's work. Some dreamed of ready fields, obedient chickens, generous harvests, simple desires, born of sweat and sun. And sometimes sweeter visions would come, a child growing strong, a frostless night, a whole loaf on the table. Waking came too early, often with a rooster's crow or the cold creeping through the blankets. Yet even that rough rising was welcomed with a quiet tenderness, for every new day brought the chance to keep going, and that for us was already a kind of blessing. Over the years, I learned to recognize the morning sounds before even opening my eyes. The door creaking open, pushed gently so as not to wake the children, the clink of a wooden spoon in the pot, the rhythmic turning of the grain mill by still sleepy hands. Outside, the sky had barely begun to lighten, but inside the cabin, the day was already being woven with quiet, repeated gestures. And in that calm rhythm, between the mist and the scent of the first smoke, we felt the world still turning, and that somehow we were still part of it. Later in life, when I had the means to travel beyond the village, I once stayed in a wealthy home where the sheets were as soft as lambskin, and the mattress seemed to float on air. I slept alone in that vast, silent softness, surrounded by expensive candles, and I could not rest. I missed the sounds of the night, the warmth of my siblings, the rustling blankets, even the scent of straw that had always been with us. It was then I understood. Sleep does not rest on luxury, but on belonging, and that sometimes the beaten floor of a hut can be more comforting than the grandest golden bed. With time, I came to see that we all sleep as we can, but also as we've learned to dream. The noble dreams of victories, alliances and legacies that will carry his name for generations. The peasant dreams of pest-free harvests, gentle rains, and a body that survives another winter. Both lie beneath the same sky, yet their hopes are as different as their pillows. And still, Both long for what no gold or crop can guarantee, a quiet night where the body finds rest and the spirit drifts softly through memories and desires only darkness understands. Now when the nights grow long and the cold visits my bones, I close my eyes and return to those days, to nights when the roof was low, the hay smelled of wet earth, and my mother whispered simple prayers before blowing out the lamp. And curiously, in those memories, I never feel as if I'm lying on the ground. I feel lifted, wrapped in something invisible but deeply real. Perhaps because true comfort comes not from a mattress or heavy curtains, but from knowing that around us pulses a world where we are loved, expected, remembered. And so I fall asleep, not as a lord in his tower, nor a peasant by the fire, but as someone who, among all these memories, found the softest place of all, the quiet heart of a time that still knows how to hold us. And it's in that heart, made of straw, wind, and remembrance, that I rest each time the night calls with its silent arms. Because there is something eternal in the way we used to sleep, each in our own way. And even now, with centuries past and modern ways in place, we still seek that same invisible shelter. A familiar gesture, a distant tune, the faded scent of home. It doesn't matter whether we sleep on feathers or on earth, what we all seek is the same, a place where our thoughts can rest and the body can, at last, forget. So tonight, if you lie in silence, listening to the wind's whisper or the calm rhythm of your own breath, know that you are not alone. Many before us have drifted to sleep cradled by those same sounds, those same quiet hopes. The nobility of dreams isn't measured by the height of your bed, but by the lightness with which you cross the darkness. And tomorrow, when you open your eyes, may a little of that ancient peace still linger, drawn from a time when sleep was, above all, a small act of courage and tenderness. Good night. May your dreams, whether humble or as high as a canopy, find you. Chapter 5. Prayers to ward off nightmares and nocturnal visitors. I remember well the night my grandmother asked the house for silence, as if inviting the world to bow before the mystery of the dark. The hearth was surrendering to fatigue, casting lazy shadows across the stone walls, and the northern wind whispered through the roof's crevices like a bored child. I was just a boy, wide-eyed and tucked under my blanket up to the chin, when I first heard the old prayer she murmured before extinguishing the final candle. Keep away from me the eyes I cannot see, the fingers I cannot touch, and the feet I cannot hear. It was a whisper older than she was, passed down by mothers, grandmothers, and great-grandmothers, woven like an invisible thread stitching generations beneath the same roof and the same moon. In those days, the night was more than just the absence of light. It was a realm of uncertainty, where sounds arrived with no source, and dreams sometimes opened doors to places no one had asked to visit. People rarely spoke of it during the day, but when the twilight turned the sky to rust and shadows crept into the corners of rooms, even the most rational among us returned to old habits. A soft-spoken prayer, a cross drawn on the forehead with a thumb, or a sprig of rue pinned behind the door. It was faith, yes, but it was also comfort. A way of saying to the darkness, I see you, and you do not scare me. Indeed, in the narrow bed I shared with my two brothers, each of us holding our corner of the blanket and our own fears, I repeated my grandmother's words in a voice barely above a breath, as if afraid the echo might attract what I was trying to keep away. There was a soothing rhythm to those phrases, like the sway of a cart on a beaten road. They said the prayers kept nightmares outside, closed the eyes of wandering spirits, and confused shadowy beings, making them forget the way to us. And even if no one knew for sure whether it worked, we all slept a little more peacefully after reciting them. Beside the wooden window, my mother would hang a small linen pouch, sewn with firm hands and ancient faith. Inside, chamomile, garlic, and a strand of hair from each child in the house, a charm to ward off nocturnal visitors, they said. It was a simple gesture, but one brimming with a love that knew well the dangers we couldn't see. Not beasts or men, but the kind that came with heavy sleep, eyes opening inside dreams, voices whispering names that shouldn't be spoken. In those moments, the scent of chamomile nearby was a quiet reminder that the room belonged more to us than to anything else that might try to enter. There was also the prayer of the 9 leaves, a tradition reserved for restless nights when someone awoke screaming or swore they'd seen something at the edge of the pillow. 9 different leaves were gathered, oak, walnut, elder among others, and placed beneath the mattress while a whispered prayer followed. Let the earth cover me, the tree hide me, and the shadow not see me. It was more than a ritual. It was nature's embrace, a truce drawn between the world of the living and whatever watched from the edges of sleep. My father, who rarely spoke of fear, would say this prayer with his eyes closed and fingers tight, as if he knew exactly what he was facing. On nights when the wind scratched at the windows and dogs barked at nothing, my grandmother lit a tallow candle and let it burn to the end, set on a saucer by the door. She said the flame told visitors that the house already had someone guarding it, a gesture as old as the home itself, passed down from the days when people believed spirits came seeking warmth and names, and perhaps they did. But with the candle burning and the prayer spoken, the house slept in peace, and so did we. I remember a night, especially cold, when sleep came slowly and fear danced in the folds of the blanket. My older sister, her eyes already closed, whispered into the dark, "Will you pray with me?" And together, like stitching silence with sacred words, we recited the prayer of the 7 names, the one grandmother said even the most stubborn spirits couldn't resist. In the name of light, of stone, of water, of salt, of wind, of fire, and of word, may no harm find me. It was beautiful. It felt like an enchantment, yet light as an invisible touch. And when we finished, the room seemed to breathe more slowly, as if even the shadows had lain down to rest. These prayers didn't come from books. They came from the mouths of elders, the memories of mothers, the startle of children. They had no set beginning or end, and every household swore theirs was the most effective. Some used hand signs, others bundles of herbs or shapes drawn in the air. Some left bread on the windowsill to distract hungry spirits. Others hung a wolf's tooth above the crib or tied a red ribbon behind the door. And while the customs varied, the purpose was always the same: to make the night a safe place, where the body could rest and the spirit wouldn't lose itself in the maze of dreams. In our village, there was a woman named Marga, already bent with age, who knew a prayer for every kind of nightmare. One to chase away the man with the hat who appeared at the foot of beds, another to silence the cry of the invisible child who wandered near cradles. They said Marga spoke to shadows, but only to teach them when it was time to leave. It was common to see her blowing ashes over door locks or whispering words in tongues no one else remembered, but which mysteriously made the whole house exhale in relief when she was done. Once I had a bad dream, the kind that jolts you awake with your heart tripping over itself. I ran to the kitchen where Marga slept wrapped in a shawl. Without asking what I'd seen, she simply stood, took a handful of salt, and drew a line across the threshold. Then she blew 3 times and said, in a voice like almost wind, "Now it won't return. Bad dreams only enter where there are no names, and you have more names than you know." From that day on, I was never afraid to sleep again, because I understood the power of those prayers wasn't just in the words, but in the hands that spoke them, with love, with faith, with the steadiness of someone who had seen the dark up close. Over time, I began crafting my own prayers. They weren't as elegant as Marga's, nor as old as grandmother's, but they were mine. Before bed, I'd draw a small circle with my finger around the pillow and say, "Only dreams with bare feet and clean hands may enter here." It was silly, perhaps, but back then, anything that calmed the heart was taken seriously, and somehow it worked. The dreams came gentler, and when they came heavy, they seemed to know they couldn't linger long. The nightly visitors, those we don't see but feel, like a weight on the mattress, a breath on the neck, or a name spoken with no voice, had their own countermeasures. My aunt, for instance, left a bowl of water under the bed so spirits would see their reflection and become distracted trying to understand their form. Others tied copper bells to doorknobs so any presence would be announced. Some slept with a sprig of rue on their wrist, like a sword made of scent and ancient courage. The truth is, back then, night was a living thing. Not merely a lack of sun, but a realm of memories, broken promises and stories still waiting to end. So we surrounded our sleep with words and symbols, as if every gesture were a small wall against the unknown. And it worked, because those simple repeated prayers turned fear into ritual and silence into comfort. As if, by praying, we were telling the world, this soul belongs to someone, and it is at peace. Even now, many seasons later, I sometimes catch myself murmuring one of those old phrases without thinking. When the night feels heavier than it should, or the wind slants through the cracks in the window, I become that boy again, eyes open in the dark, and I whisper softly, as if calling an old friend, "Keep away from me the eyes I cannot see." And for a moment, I feel again the fading warmth of the hearth, the scent of chamomile on the pillow, and the quiet certainty that, even in the dark, there was always something or someone keeping watch over us. And so, in that house of stone and wind, where every night felt longer than the day, we learned that sleep was also an act of faith. Not only divine faith, but faith in simple gestures. A blanket pulled with care, a candle burning by the door, a voice whispering prayers like stitches of protection into the dark. The nightmares came, yes, the visitors too, but they never stayed for long, because they knew that house held names spoken with strength and memories bright enough to cast light even over the oldest shadows. Now, when the streetlights go out and the world outside retreats, I like to imagine there's still someone in some distant home saying their words before bed. Maybe not the same ones, but spoken with the same hope. Because as long as someone believes in the power of a whispered phrase at the edge of sleep, the shadows will keep hesitating at the door. And so we continue night after night, protected by the prayers we've inherited and the ones we've learned to invent. Chapter 6. Sleeping beside the fire, afraid it might die. There was a time when fire was not just company, but protection. On nights when the wind slipped through the cracks in the roof and shadows dragged along the corners, the heart of the house was a small bed of glowing embers, tended with care, watched with devotion. I remember it well, the crackling sound that lulled us all to sleep, mingled with the scent of old wood slowly burning. The hearth wasn't luxurious, just a pit dug into the packed earth, circled by stones blackened with age. But to us, it was the most precious thing we had. We slept around it, each in their corner, wrapped in rough blankets and simple thoughts. There was always someone assigned to watch the flames through the night. Sometimes it was my father, other times my grandmother, who dozed with a twig in her hand and one eye half open, as if dreaming with her gaze still fixed on the world. The fear wasn't of monsters or ghosts, but of the cold, that biting cold that, if the fire died, crept through our clothes and bones, waking us with chattering teeth and colorless fingers. There was a silent art in keeping the fire alive. It wasn't just tossing on logs and waiting. There was a delicate gesture in stirring the coals with a thin branch, the gentle breath blown so sparks wouldn't get lost in the dark. I'd watch in silence when it was my mother's turn. She would kneel beside the fire like someone in prayer, her face glowing gold and shadowed, and she would whisper something to the flames, perhaps a request, perhaps a quiet thank you for another frostless night indoors. That soothed me. It was as if the fire knew us by name. One time, it was my turn to keep watch. I was just a boy, my eyes heavy, my heart pulsing with pride. My father woke me with a light touch on the shoulder and pointed toward the hearth. "Just until the stars shift a little," he said, pulling the blanket back over himself. I sat before the fire like a timid sentinel, knees drawn in, a blanket wrapped over my shoulders. The house slept. Only the muffled snore of an uncle, the pop of the wood, and the distant moan of the wind through bare trees could be heard. It was that night I learned the value of warmth, not just from the flame, but from the quiet responsibility we shared. The embers, even when small, held a near magic presence. They didn't speak, but they said so much. In them, you could trace the day's story. The twisted branch burning slowly had come from the fallen tree by the stream. The faintly sweet scent came from a root my grandmother had placed to perfume the air, and the smoke, always rising in lazy spirals, seemed to carry our worries into the night sky, dissolving them bit by bit. When sleep began to pull at me, I'd nibble on a piece of stale bread just to stay awake and keep the coals alive. A simple act, but in that moment, it felt as important as keeping the world turning. With time, I learned that keeping the fire wasn't just a task. It was an act of care for everyone asleep around me. The one who guarded the fire also guarded the dreams of others. When the sky began to lighten and the neighbor's rooster crowed in the distance, the cold had already been pushed back, beaten by the quiet effort of whoever had watched over the flames. No praise was given, no celebration. But seeing the peaceful faces of my still sleeping siblings, I knew I had done my part. That's what bound us. Not blood, not luck, but the calm passing of this silent vigil around the fire. On the coldest mornings, when everyone finally stirred, the fire still glowed, timid but present. And there was something deeply comforting in that constant shimmer, as if it whispered, "You were not alone." My grandfather, rising to his feet, would always glance at the embers, then at whoever had stood watch. He wouldn't say a word, just a small nod and a half smile, the quiet recognition of a promise kept. In those moments, I felt part of something ancient and steady, like the stones that circled the hearth, something that endured simply by being there. By day, the fire became another kind of warmth. It cooked our morning porridge, warmed the water for washing hands, kept away the bolder cats trying to snatch leftover crumbs. But at night, it returned to being spark and sentinel. It was always surrounded by whispered stories, fingers pointing at sparks that looked like shooting stars, eyes lost in the bright orange as if watching an oracle. We each had our nights beside the fire, our little vigils, our moments of listening and quiet. And so, between embers and sighs, we made it through the harshest winters, not with bravado, but with tenderness. I remember one night in particular, when snow fell so heavily the roof groaned under its weight. The firewood was damp, and the flames struggled to survive. My little sister shivered beside me, her feet wrapped in a piece of cloth that had once been a curtain. I moved closer to the hearth and with unsteady hands stirred the coals, just as I'd seen done so many times before. I felt the warmth return slowly, timid but real, and in my sister's gaze, the trust of someone who believed the world, at least within those walls, was safe. That night, I learned that keeping the fire alive also meant keeping hope alive. There was poetry, too, in that daily ritual. The fire didn't just warm our bodies, it brought us back to childhood, to the stories whispered by my grandmother over sips of tea, to the contrast between the howling wind outside and the gentle crackle of dry wood. When I finally lay down after the vigil, my cheeks still warm, my clothes smelling of smoke, my heart was still. It was as if each surviving flame softly whispered, "You are here, and all is well." And perhaps, just perhaps, that was exactly what the fire had always meant to say. Over the years, I came to understand that the nightly vigil was an inheritance, passed from calloused hands to clumsy ones, from alert hearts to those just learning to listen to silence. It wasn't about heroism nor about strength. It was about care, about staying awake while others needed to sleep, about learning to see beauty in the flicker of a flame, even when your eyes burned with fatigue. My father used to say that a house that keeps its fire burning through the night is a house that never breaks from within, and I believed him. I still do. Now and then, I find myself remembering that gentle warmth and that trembling light as I watch the shy flicker of a candle on a windowsill. And I think there is something eternal in that gesture, keeping a flame alive as the night passes. It doesn't matter if the hearth is only memory now, if the house is different, if the voices have gone quiet with time. What remains is that silent tenderness, that ancient pact passed down through generations, to care for one another, even in sleep, even in darkness. Because as long as there is someone feeding the embers, there will always be warmth and a home. And when the winters stretched longest, nearly endless, it was the fire that reminded us it would all pass. The embers glowing through the night seemed to whisper that the world's cold could never be stronger than the warmth we built together. And even when the firewood dwindled, and all we had left was what remained from the day before, we still found a way to make it glow, if only for a few more hours, enough to cradle us into sleep and keep the cold away for one more night. That's how we lived, around the fire, our eyes tired but our hearts calm. It wasn't a time of abundance, but it was full of small, precious gestures. And maybe that's why even now, when I close my eyes to the sound of a log crackling or the flicker of candlelight in the dark, I feel myself back in that simple room, with the whole world asleep around me, and me there, watching the gentle glow of the embers, guarding an ancient secret. Because in the end, sleeping beside the fire was more than necessity. It was an act of love.